I'm tagging along with paleontologist Joe Kchodl and fossil hunter Roy Weber in search of 480 million-year-old fossils right here in our own backyard.
What you've got here is a treasure trove of what life was like 488 million years ago when we were the bottom of an ancient saltwater tropical ocean.
9 million acres of forest, 1,700 miles of continuous shoreline, 4,300 lakes, 12,000 miles of streams, more than 300 waterfalls, 15 counties, 2 time zones, and 1 area code. Welcome to the Upper Peninsula. Welcome to 906 Outdoors. Some 488 million years ago, what would become the Upper Peninsula was situated beneath a warm, shallow sea somewhere south of the equator. Dinosaurs were still 287 million years in the future. No life existed on land, but the oceans teemed with a variety of creatures. All of these millions upon millions of years later, evidence of these creatures can still be found, if you know where to look and what to look for. I don't. So I got together with a couple of guys that do.
My name is Paleo Joe. Actually, my name is Joe Kchodl, but people call me Paleo Joe. I live here in Midland, Michigan. I'm a Michigan children's book author, a dinosaur hunter, paleontologist, and I'm up here right now in the UP doing a little bit of fossil hunting. I've got about 5 children's books that I've written. I've written several adult books. I've got 3 museum exhibits currently touring the country, and I just love fossils. And this is what we're doing here in Escanaba today. Really, I didn't come up here very often. When I did, I came up to sightsee and enjoy the wonderful Upper Peninsula. But recently, a man by the name of Roy Weber came down to Alpena on a dig with me, and he told me about some of the exposures up here in the UP. Very recently, I saw an article that came out about the Ordovician deposits here in the UP. So again, thanks to Roy, I came up here, and we're going to start digging some of this stuff and see what we can find.
My interest in fossils, I've had about my whole life, fossils and prehistoric animals. I lived in Ohio at one time, Dayton, Ohio, and right across the street from my house was a swimming pool, and they had a gravel parking lot, like a golf ball sized gravel parking lot. And I went over there with my brother one day, and we were just looking around, well, let's go look for a fossil, just on a whim. I walked around 5 minutes and I found about 2/3 of a trilobite. Apparently this gravel was like hardened limestone. So I've had an interest in fossils and prehistoric animals my whole life.
Before you go collecting fossils, it's really important to think about safety. Safety is always number one. The other thing you need to think about is permissions. If you're digging on state land, federal land, BLM land, you don't do it. You're going to get in trouble. You find private property or public access property. That's usually your best bet where you can find fossils. Again, make sure you always obtain permission before you go digging. When you go out digging, there's a couple things you want to bring along. You want to bring along a first aid kit. You never know when you're going to get a cut or a scratch, something to cover that up so you can continue digging throughout the day. A lot of times I bring out a bunch of knee pads. We spend an awful lot of time down on our hands and knees digging these creatures that we call fossils, and knee pads come in very handy. They'll cushion your knees and make it a lot easier for you to dig fossils. I also bring lots and lots of gloves. Gloves are important. As you can see, the tips of these gloves, they're pretty much worn out. We also use different kinds of tools when we're out in the field. I like to bring along a little trowel, a garden trowel. Sometimes the sediments we're digging in is more like dirt or sand rather than just rocks themselves. When the sediments are pretty hard, I bring out my trusty rock hammer. There are several kinds of rock hammers you can use. This one kind of has a pick end. They also make one that's got a chisel end on the end of it. And these are essential when you're trying to break rock and look for fossils inside the rocks. So back during the Ordovician period, about 400 million years ago, we were down by the equator underwater. Now, we know that we were down by the equator because we find creatures that are called corals. Corals are ancient saltwater tropical creatures that only live in warm, shallow tropical seas. So when we find those here in the state of Michigan, that tells us at one time we were down by the equator, down where the water is very warm.
"906 Outdoors" is brought to you by Race Driven, your source for premier power sports products.
The Ordovician period was a time when the seas were teeming with life. There was not a lot of life on land. Plants were just starting to come around, but the seas were full of life. Most of the creatures we find here are brachiopods. Brachiopods are seashells. We also have a creature called a cephalopod. We have cephalopods today. They're called octopus and squid. But back during the Ordovician period, the cephalopods had hard external shells. They were long tubular shells that came down to a point. And they also had those tentacles, kind of like a modern-day octopus. There's also other things that were crawling around in the oceans called trilobites. And trilobites are the ancient saltwater sea creatures that kind of remind us of a pill bug or a roly-poly. Some of the fossils we're finding here in the Escanaba area they're Ordovician in age. They're from around 488 million to about 453 million years old. That's way older than 400 million years. That's way older than dinosaurs. These are some of the first forms of life. And here we have formations called the Richmond Formation and the Maysville Formation. And oddly enough, the same formations that we find here, we find in southern Indiana, southern Ohio, and northern Kentucky. That's kind of interesting. That's a really long distance to have the same type of fossils. It's the same type of formation. Some of the fossils we find here are really interesting. Trilobites are the ancient saltwater sea creatures that crawled on the ocean floor. We call them trilobites because they have three lobes, one lobe in the middle and one lobe on each side. They're also divided three ways horizontally into a head section, we call that a cephalon, the body section, we call that the thorax, and the tail section, we call that the pygidium. And this is an Isotylus maximus. This one comes from Ohio, but there are also Isotylus that are found here in Escanaba in Stonington. Again, these guys had a hard external exoskeleton, and in order for them to grow, they had to molt or shed that exoskeleton. That skeleton would fall apart into lots of bits and pieces. It's very rare to find a complete trilobite that looks like this. But just getting out of the car, I walked over to the hill here, and I found a rock that's got a small piece of a trilobite on it. This is, again, an Isotylus trilobite piece. These creatures would molt or shed that exoskeleton. Then that exoskeleton would fall apart down to the bottom of the ocean, and that's where it would be preserved. So again, this is part of a trilobite, part of that guy down there, but it's been broken up into bits and pieces. We also have creatures that were kind of the super predators of the oceans back then. They're called cephalopods. Cephalopods are alive in the oceans today. They're actually octopus and squid. This is a large example of an Ordovician cephalopod, and they are a creature that had a hard external shell. Today, cephalopods in the ocean, the octopus, don't have a hard shell. Back then they did. This is a large conical shape. It came down to a very sharp point. And they had tentacles, just like modern-day octopus. They had a beak, they had eyes. These guys were the super predators back then. They grew in size all the way up to 15 feet long. These were really giant creatures, super predators of the ancient Ordovician seas. But we can also find other creatures here that are called crinoids. Crinoids are actually an animal. Most people call these things lilies of the sea or sea lilies, but they're not plants, they're actually animals. They grow on a really tall stalk. And many times across the state of Michigan, you will find lots of round discs that look a lot like poker chips. People like to call those things Indian beads. They're just round discs with a hole in the middle of them. Well, that creature actually grew on those really tall stalks. When it's a whole bunch of those discs together, we call it a column, and it grew on a really tall stalk. On top of that stalk, there was a ball. We call that ball the calyx. That is the main structure of the creature, and on top of that, it had long feathered fingers. This thing was a filter feeder. It would capture its food in the water and bring it down inside. When these creatures died, they also had an exoskeleton. They would fall apart into thousands of little pieces. Again, very rare to find a complete crinoid that looks like this. Many times you will find just the discs, or sometimes you'll be lucky and find the calyx. This is an example of a calyx. This one actually comes from the Devonian period, long after the Ordovician period. This is the top of that crinoid. This is the ball. Right there is the attachment point for the discs, for the stalk that it grew on. And all these little holes around here, this is where the feathered fingers or the feathered arms would come out of. And this is how the creature would eat using those feathered fingers. These are actually also quite rare to find, very difficult, but sometimes you do get lucky and you do find a complete crinoid crown, calyx, and stem. And they also had what's called a holdfast, which is not really a root because it's not a plant, but it had a way to attach itself to the bottom of the ocean. There's a lot of brachiopods in here. Brachiopods are seashells. Back then, there were no human beings on Earth to pick up seashells and put them in their pockets. So these shells would wash up onto beaches, wash into shallow lagoon areas, and then it would be preserved. And just as I'm getting ready to start picking up some of these brachiopods, come on down here. We haven't seeded this place. We haven't put anything there. We haven't taken anything out. There's absolutely a beautiful brachiopod right there. That's a beautiful little seashell right there. That guy's about 488 to 450 million years old, and here's another part of a seashell. That one's called a Platystrophia. And again, these are the same kind of fossils we find down around the Cincinnati area. Right here is an impression of a very large brachiopod. This is a very large seashell right there. This guy is probably maybe around the size of a baseball or so, and that's the impression of a seashell. That's the ribs of the seashell right there. This place is extremely rich. As you walk along the side here, and I haven't really walked much, I'm right here where we started, just picking up some of these rocks and clumps of dirt, you still see more seashells right here. These again are called brachiopods. They're also called commonly lamp shells because they kind of look like a lamp. The top part of the shell is very convex. The bottom part is sometimes concave or very flat. And at the end, they had a little tiny hole. That's where the pedicle or the foot would come out. That would actually attach itself to the bottom of the ocean using that foot. It would sit there, open up, and it would be a filter feeder as well. Lots and lots of brachiopods here. Again, no human beings back then. These things just kept piling up higher and higher. We also have a lot of different kinds of corals. Again, most of the things that lived in the oceans back then were animals. We didn't have a lot of plants back then. Corals are creatures that grew either solitary by themselves or they grew as a colony coral. One of the famous colony corals around the entire world is called Petoskey stone. A Petoskey stone is a colony coral we call hexagonaria. And it's not a Petoskey stone until you slice it and polish it and charge people lots of money for it. Then it's a Petoskey stone. In its natural form, it's called hexagonaria coral. And corals begin their life as a free-floating larva floating through the water. They attach themselves to a rock and they start to grow. They start to excrete that limy exoskeleton, that hard exoskeleton, and they reproduce asexually, which means they send out buds. So as that colony coral starts to grow, it will just start sending out buds. And that's where we get that giant coral head that we call a Petoskey stone, that nice, wonderful bunch of corals.
It's time for a 906 Outdoors Wild Game Break. Today's Wild Game Break is brought to you by Cooking Wild Seasonings. Make it fresh, make it yours. Find out more at cookingwildseasonings.com.
So you've got your Cooking Wild fish batter and you're ready to do a fish fry. Beer or water? Well, both will work. The reason we like beer? Carbonation.
Carbonation is one of the biggest factors in giving you a coating that is thin and light rather than thick and greasy. That said, you could also use non-alcoholic beer or seltzer water to get the same results. And ice cold beer will make colder batter. The shock of the cold batter when it hits the hot oil will help make it nice and crispy. 906 Outdoors is brought to you by Cooking Wild Seasonings. Make it fresh, make it yours.
The fossils that form here formed from creatures that died and sank to the bottom of the ocean. Water is extremely critical in the formation of fossils. In that water, suspended in that water, there are a lot of minerals. And as that creature is rotting below the surface of the water or below the sand, it's being replaced microscopically by those chemicals and minerals. So after 400 million years, these are no longer the creatures they were back then. They've been replaced by those hard minerals. And that's basically the fossilization process. There's a lot of discussion how long it takes for something to become a fossil. I guess it really all depends on how quickly it mineralizes. Some people are saying in as little as 4,000 years it will turn into a fossil. Some people say it happens even much quicker than that. Some people say it happens much longer than that. It all depends on the salinity of the water, the mineralization in the water. All those things contribute to the creation of a fossil. And that's why, again, 99% of life on Earth is gone. We'll never see it. A very, very small percentage of life on Earth has actually been preserved as fossils. So when you find a fossil, you're actually finding a real treasure. A lot of people think diamonds are really cool. Diamonds are really, a treasure, but fossils are even a better treasure because there's so few of them that are found. When you find a place like this that's loaded with fossils, consider yourself lucky. This is really, really a good location. You never know what you're going to find. And when you find a place that's this rich, it's really extra special. Right down here, I was getting ready to put this by my pile of fossils, and I look down here, and there's absolutely a perfect fossil right there. There's another Platystrophia, absolutely unbelievable brachiopod right here. Come on and look at some of this stuff. Mostly brachiopods here. We've got some really nice ones. This is something right now I can't even identify. I've got to take it back and look at it, clean it up a little bit. That looks really interesting right there. We also have this wonderful brachiopod right here. Look at that. It's a complete shell. One of the things you want to do when you get back home to kind of clean these up is just a little bit of soap and water. That will kind of clean up that fossil, get it looking really nice. But also I started looking around and I found this thing right here. This is one of those bryozoans. Again, these are animals. These are not plants. People call them commonly, they're called moss animals. They've got tiny little holes. These are creatures that kind of like corals that grow branching on the bottom of the ocean. And then again, right here, we've got a wonderful example of some more brachiopods. We've got one there, one there. So again, just lots and lots of seashells on the side of the road here. The Ordovician period was really rich with lots and lots of life. On land, no life, very little life, very primitive plants. But the oceans are absolutely teeming with life. Again, 488 million years ago, that's long before the age of dinosaurs. You see there's a rock right here, and this is something we call hash. This is the bottom of the ocean that all kind of fossilized together. If you take a good close look at it, you got a wonderful brachiopod right there. This one's coming home with me today, but it's surrounded by lots and lots of other types of life. And mostly they're brachiopods, seashells, but there are other things mixed in here as well. And this is, again, what we call hash. Everything that was alive in the ocean, as it dies, it falls at the bottom of the ocean. It gets covered up by sand and mud and the slurry coming in off the land, and it begins to start the fossilization process. Sometimes it's just a slurry of all kinds of dirt and sand and sediment, and it ends up creating clay. And that's kind of what we have here on the side of this hill. This is just a big clay hill, and the clay actually helps to preserve some of these fossils as well. But the best part about the clay is the rains. As the rains come down, it washes through all this sediment and it washes away a lot of that clay, so the fossils are right there on the surface. They're exposed. You can see them and pick them up and put them in your pocket and go. The problem with this kind of a sediment here is you're not going to find a complete trilobite. Normally, complete trilobites are found where you have to break a lot of rock because, again, when the sediment is this loose, the trilobites will fall apart in those bits and pieces. Even if it's complete, when you start looking for it and you find it, it'll start to fall apart very quickly because it's on this very, very loose sediment. A lot of times I take crazy glue to the field with me. I'll take white glue with me, and if I find something complete on very fragile rock, I will dab it with glue, dab it with crazy glue. We make our own glue we call Vinac. It's a mixture of acetone and plastic beads. We put that glue on the fossil. That helps to stabilize it so we can bring it home and clean it. There's a nice piece of coral right there. This is a beautiful hunk of coral. At most, they're 488 million years old. At least they're 450 million years old. I mean, these things have survived all those years, and they're in almost perfect condition, just the way they were the day they died. Corals begin their life again as a free-floating larva attached to a rock, then they start to grow. You can almost imagine a hurricane coming across the water, picks up all that dirt and sediment, and washes it into these lagoons. When the hurricane is underwater, it'll take these corals, and it'll knock them down. The waves will just kind of come over and knock them down. Then that slurry comes in off the land and buries these things, and that's when the fossilization process begins. All the organic matter in that coral, in that brachiopod, in that trilobite, all rots away, but it's being replaced microscopically by the chemicals and minerals inside that water. They're suspended in the water. They percolate through the ground, they percolate through the mud and sand and into the creature that's going to become a fossil. So really, after 450 million years, this is no longer a piece of coral. It's now a piece of mineralized material that's got the exact same size and shape as the original coral. Really wonderful.
Today's show is brought to you in part by Rapid River Knife Works, home of Michigan's largest custom knife factory showroom.
Here's another great example of the seafloor. It's amazing how some of these things are preserved. They're preserved one on top of each other, on top of another, on top of another. This whole piece of rock right here, the cross section of it, you can just see all the different creatures that have been compressed in this one piece of rock. These flat areas here are called bedding planes. As the creatures die and fall to the bottom, they get covered by sand. That's a natural point where that rock will cleave, it'll break open, and we call that a bedding plane. So this is one bedding plane here. Then more dirt and rock falls on top of it, and then that creates another bedding plane. And normally when we find rocks that are sedimentary, you can see those lines, those bedding planes. You tilt it up on its end and you tap it on the end with a chisel and a hammer, and that'll break it open. It'll cleave right on that bedding plane, exposing what's inside. And again, this is just an excellent piece. You take this home and put it in white vinegar for, you know, half a day, and it will start to eat away some of this this limey rock, the limestone around it. First of all, before you do that, you know, take it with, you know, soap and water and a brush and just kind of brush it off and clean it off, and then dip it in vinegar, and that will help to peel away some of this extra matrix right there. Matrix is what we call the rock that surrounds those things that are fossils. There's a bryozoan right there, and these things again grew like branches on a tree. When you look closely here, you see all these little tiny bumps on that thing. The wonderful detail that these bryozoans actually do exhibit. This is actually a piece of a trilobite right there. This looks like it's part of the head or the tail. And right on the back side of it, a really nice brachiopod. It's so amazing to see all this stuff here. A lot of times I look for these large chunks. That's where you tend to find really nice fossils, but this is really spectacular. If you look closely here, it's just loaded with literally thousands and thousands of different types of fossils. You've got brachiopods, there's little bits of bryozoan here, all kinds of broken bits and pieces of other creatures. Because you can actually see one of the bedding planes right there. That's where I would put my hammer and I would break it right there. It would split open and there would be more stuff inside there. But this is just a wonderful example of the bottom of the ocean. This is the entire ecosystem. All the creatures lived in that ecosystem were all on that rock right there. Spectacular. We have lots of limestone around this area, around Escanaba and over to the eastern side of the UP. Those limestone exposures, when you're walking on the rock, you're actually walking on the bottom of those ancient tropical oceans. If you think about the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, that's kind of what Michigan looked like back during the Ordovician and Devonian periods. We were the bottom of a tropical ocean. Lots of corals growing, lots of life, lots of creatures swimming around in those ancient tropical seas. For you guys living in the area, Escanaba is a wonderful place to find fossils. Along the Escanaba River, there's other areas that you can look up online. Google fossils in the Escanaba area, Delta County, and you'll see different places where you can go. Again, please make sure that you have permission to dig. Make sure you have all the safety equipment. Pull your cars as far off the road as you can to be safe. Get out here and really enjoy hunting for fossils. What you've got here is a treasure trove of what life was like 488 million years ago when we were the bottom of an ancient saltwater tropical ocean. Get out there and enjoy what the UP has to offer.
Feel free to join us on Facebook or visit us at 906outdoors.com for a look at all of our shows, as well as the 906 Outdoors Fishing Report, shopping, and more. Thanks for watching, and we invite you to join us next week for another adventure right here on 906 Outdoors.